Yo, what's up guys? Imagine Create Destroy here. In this week's video, I'm going to be using these old military figures, specifically the special ops looking dudes in all black. Now, should I make a tactical human centipede? A tactical goon sesh?
Disgusting!
Nah, maybe next time. Since they are giving off the vibes of those old Navy SEAL commercials where they pop up from underwater in a river or something, guns at the ready, just looking all badass. So, I decided I'm going to build that. These guys were looking a little plainly painted for my liking, so I'm going to touch them up a little bit with some dry brushing. I just use a lighter tone for the colors used on these minis. Now, while I'm doing the dry brushing, I just wanted to touch up on where I got the minis for this build and why they're already painted. So these guys actually came from my dad. I told him I was making dioramas when I started this channel, and he had a little something for me. Then pulled these out of a box he had in storage. Apparently he bought them for me to play with when I was a kid, then quickly realized that these were not for little kids, so he packed them back up and forgot about them till now. Luckily he kept them for probably over 20 years because they've inspired me to make this awesome diorama. Once I got them dry brushed to my liking, they're looking a little better. I'll set them aside and we'll get started on the base for this build. For the base, I started by hot gluing these pieces of XPS foam together that I cut off camera. Then, like a big stupid idiot dummy that I am, forgot to hit record when I cut out the channel for the river SEAL Team 6 here is going to be coming out of. I realized this whole thing was a bit too big also, so I cut off the excess with the straight cutting tool of my hot wire cutter, then swapped heads and used the foam cutter to add a little bit more natural texture to the riverbed. Also rubbed the tool on the raised edges just to help flatten them out a little bit. Then I got out my torch and used it on the flat tops for the parts that are going to be land. The torch gives an uneven surface that adds a really nice depth to the build. I let the foam cool down, then used some modeling paste to fill the gap lines between the layers of foam. Once that dried, I painted the whole thing with black paint and Mod Podge mix. I did this to seal the river so no resin leaks later when I do the resin pour, and to protect the foam when I spray painted on the base coat, which I didn't end up doing, but you know, hindsight's 20/20. Or 8:20 p.m. for us Americans. I'll set that aside to dry and get to work on making a rock mold to make some plaster rocks. You might be thinking, why not just use rocks as rocks? Well, I'd have to go outside to get rocks. I'd much rather stay inside and make things that look like they're outside. So we'll just do this instead. I rolled out some air dry clay, pressed some rocks into it, then mixed up the plaster of Paris to fill the mold. I'll make a bunch of these rocks at a time, even though I'm only going to use a few for this build. I'll just save the rest for future builds, and I'll save the mold as well so I can make some another time. I'll pop these wannabe rocks out and admire my not so hard work. After I'm done showing off my fake rocks made from real rocks, I just washed off the excess clay and glued them onto the base with some super glue. Just remember, don't use super glue on straight foam, it'll ruin your work up until this point. I'll glue on some smaller rocks that I got from Michael's and some sticks I got from outside, just to add a little bit more depth to the diorama. After I'm done there, I'll add some texture paste. Any texture paste will do because I'm just going to paint over this in the next step anyway. Base coat the base. I use this Death World Forest to start. I know everybody doesn't have an airbrush, but you can always use a rattle can with similar colors. You can find almost any color you need on Amazon. Then I'll follow up with a 50-50 mix of the first color and this ochre and camo. With this one, I'll spray from one side just to give some depth and variation to the base. After that dried, I dry brushed on the ochre and camo over the entire ground just to highlight all the raised edges of the base. Next up, I'll take this Rhinox hide, Steel Legion drab, and dark brown to paint the sticks on the ground. I used all three colors and randomly applied them. When applying the paint, I wet blended the paints together just so they blend together well. Then we can do the rocks. I used an Eshin Gray, Dawnstone, and Baylor Brown. This color helps bring some variation to the boringness of the grays. I'll use the same wet blending technique I used for the sticks just to give a good transition between colors. As I'm sure you've noticed, the ground is brown and my base is very much so not brown, but don't worry, we'll fix that with this Adrax Earthshade wash. Citadel washes are pretty glossy, which is great for the wetlands look that I'm going for. I followed it up with the Biotan green wash, applying it to the still wet brown wash, geez that was a tongue twister, in select areas just to add some variation. I let that completely dry before moving on to the next step, which is to dry brush. I dry brush the ground with the light green, the sticks with the light brown, and then the rocks with the light gray, then an off-white only on the highest points of the rocks. Now I use this natural umber pigment to add a little bit more life to the base. I use it around the sticks and the rocks, and then just a little bit on the sticks themselves. Before I add the grass tufts, I'll super glue Seal Team 6 here into place so I don't limit my placement options when putting down the tufts. First I'll put down moss tufts on the riverbed. I used a light green and a dark green moss. Adding the tufts is one of my favorite parts of any build, just because it really adds so much life to the piece and really brings everything together. Then I'll work on the ground level. I used a larger dark green tuft and a smaller light green tuft to add some variation. And finally, I use these Gamer Grass laser cut banana tree plants to give that jungle feel. Before I do the resin pour, I'll hot glue on some acrylic to the sides, then mix up the resin. I used a deep pour epoxy resin and alcohol inks to dye it. I wanted a grimy feel to the river, so I used green and brown to dye the resin. Then I mixed it up for 10 long minutes and poured it into the base. Then every 15 minutes for about an hour or so, I popped any bubbles with my blowtorch, which unfortunately wasn't long enough because I still got some bubbles in the end result. Oh well, better luck next time. I let the resin dry for a few days, then got ready to finish this build up. Pulled off the acrylic, peeled off the hot glue holding it on, and unfortunately there were some large bubbles that I didn't notice and it kind of messed up the resin a bit, but I'll try to fix that as best as I can. I cut the bubbles off, then I'll add the water ripples with gloss Mod Podge. I was hoping the Mod Podge would cover the holes in the resin, so we'll see how that works. I'll use my airbrush to make the ripple effects, but a computer duster can would work just as well. Then I use the Mod Podge to make the little dudes look wet from going through the water. Next we can hot glue on this old Reese's cereal box I cut to hide the lines between the foam layers. I left a little bit extra on top so I can trim off the excess to give a flush fit. Then I used a cheap black acrylic paint to base coat the cardboard. Used a black 4.0 paint to paint the sides. And that's another diorama down. Thanks everyone for watching. I'll catch y'all next week. Let's roll the beauty shots.